Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. We are so glad you're joining us for our first online workshop series. We are the student chapter of the National Press Photographers Association at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm Emily. I'm the president of our chapter. Sorry for just being a voice. My laptop camera is broken, but this session is being recorded in order for it to be a resource to be accessible in the future. And once we have it saved and uploaded, we'll share it with everyone. Right now, everyone is muted, but please feel free to use the chat for any questions or comments. And I'm here if anyone needs help. And if there are any questions in the chat, I'll say them so Ari doesn't have to pay attention to the chat constantly, but go ahead and pass it on to Ari to lead the session.
Cool. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Once again, I mentioned it a little earlier, but I am sitting here outside, so apologies for the wind noise and whatever environmental sound might be behind us. So this session is really geared to getting people started to shooting video, particularly on DSLR cameras. And so I'll try to, in addition to what's on the screen in the text and visual form, I'll also try to demonstrate here. So if you could get your Zoom set up so you can see me and the screen, that would be really ideal for learning. So let's get started here. So just a little bit about me. Here's a really brooding, dark photo of me, as every journalist should have. Makes me look intense. I'm not that intense. I'm a recent graduate of UNC's journalism school, so I graduated in May. I guess you could call it a graduation. We didn't really have a ceremony. And I'm an incoming student at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. I've worked in a couple of places. In the fall, I worked at NBC News in their investigative unit, and I've also worked for local papers, the Asheville Citizen-Times, some other places as well here in the Chapel Hill area. So this is some of my video work. I thought we'd start out maybe by just watching a little bit of this. Hopefully y'all can hear audio, but if not, it's not super important because we're mainly going to be talking about visuals here today. So let's just watch this for a minute. This is a documentary I did last summer about an opioid recovery organization in Wilkes County, North Carolina. If it will load. Here we go.
80% of the stories that I hear started with the prescription. I had an ankle injury that required 5 surgeries. That's when I was prescribed opiates. Instantly, it was like something was different in my body. You'll see comments on Facebook and stuff all the time that are talking about how all there is in Wilkes are drugs. It's unfortunate that that's like the perspective that people feed on. I had children, I'd been married, I had bought my own house. I was a productive human. When the prescriptions ran out, my body still said that I needed to have pain medication. My life started becoming turmoil. I ended up losing my job, losing my place to live. My mom came and took the children. In my bedroom.
So if you want to go and watch the rest of that, you are more than welcome to. I'll have it linked in the PowerPoint, and also you can just go on my website and find that as well. So this is another documentary I made last summer. We'll just watch a minute or two of this as well. It's muted. We don't want to watch ads. Alright, well, we'll just skip it for now. I don't know why it's going on to a Joe Rogan video. That doesn't make any sense to me. Alright, we'll skip it. But if you want to go and watch that, it's a documentary I made about sugar dating at UNC last summer. So let's talk cameras for a second, because that's what we're here to talk about. I'm going to show you a bunch of examples of video cameras that are used in the industry from the top down. So this camera here has a really fantastic name, at least I think. It's called the Ari Alexa. I would say like 90 to 95% of your Hollywood movies are shot on the Ari Alexa. It's a big, heavy $30,000 plus camera, and that's just the camera itself. That's not including the lenses and all the accessories that you have to put on it. But you know, this is mainly what Hollywood movies are shot on. For your documentary films, you might see cameras like this. This is a Canon C100. It's they call them cinema cameras. They're just specialized cameras for shooting video. They're a little bit lighter, a little bit tougher, more run and gun. So your documentaries, you might see cameras like this. Mirrorless cameras like this one. This is a Sony a7 III. I have one here. This is my personal Sony a6000. These are becoming really popular. They're called mirrorless because if you see like DSLR cameras, like this Canon 5D Mark III, they have a mirror here. I don't know if you can see it. This thing that flaps up and down like this. And so the modern cameras, to save, you know, you can see the size difference between these two cameras. To save size and save weight, they just took the mirror out. So just nothing covering the sensor, basically. And so these mirrorless cameras are becoming really popular. One other thing, the mirror is to facilitate you looking through the viewfinder. So when I look through this camera like this, I can see my screen because the light is going through the lens and then bouncing up and hitting my eye. With these mirrorless cameras, they just have like a little screen right here called electronic viewfinder, and that's really nice for previewing your image. And then obviously everybody has one of these, or most everybody does. It's an iPhone. You know, the iPhone can be a really great video tool if you know how to use it properly. You know, I just got back from Belize a few months ago as part of a UNC journalism class, and we took some of our underwater footage with iPhones because it's, you know, very expensive to get an underwater housing for these big 5D cameras or these mirrorless cameras. So some of the underwater footage is just shot on iPhone. So what I'm trying to get across here is that cameras are just tools, and you want to pick the best tool for the job. The Alexa is not always the best tool for the job, even though it shoots probably the nicest video. It's big, it's expensive, it's heavy, you can't swing it around. There's a saying that says the best camera is the one you have with you, and most people have an iPhone with them all the time. But that being said, we're going to be teaching on this camera here. This is the Canon 5D Mark III. This is not my personal camera, this is the journalism school's, but I'm going to be teaching mainly on this today because it's kind of the industry standard. Most newsrooms will have a camera like this or its successor, the 5D Mark IV. And the controls are going to be, even if this isn't your personal camera, if you have a Nikon or a Sony, a lot of the stuff will be very similar. The menu details might be a little bit different, but the settings and things will be the same. So let's move on. So the first step is to turn on the camera. And so on this Canon 5D, you just have this on-off switch here. You can see on-off. We can just switch it on like this. And you want to make sure that you're in manual mode. I don't know if y'all can see that, the M. And the reason we want it to be in manual mode is because we want to have full control of what the camera is doing. If you let the camera take control, it often makes really stupid decisions and your video ends up looking bad, or your photos. So we want to make sure to switch it to manual mode. The way we do that is there's a little button here up top. You can see it right there. And we can just turn this and make sure the tick mark is on the M. So once you turn it on, you're going to see nothing. That's normal. That's okay. You can see there's nothing on the back of the screen here. The way we know the camera is on is there's this top dial, and you'll see these numbers here. We'll chill for a second. Let the bow tower do its thing. You'll see these numbers. And so, you know, this screen is like a calculator screen, like one of the old calculator screens, so it's not backlit like your iPhone is. So what do you do if it's dark? Well, the Canon people have thought of that, and there's this little button up top here, and if you press that at daylight right now, so you won't be able to see it, but if you press that when it's dark, the screen will light up for a second or two, and you can see, a quick glance of some of your settings. We're going to talk about all the numbers on this screen in just a second. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to dive into the Q menu. So what is this mysterious Q menu? Is it a vast right-wing conspiracy? No. Is it James Bond's quartermaster, this guy? Nope. The Q menu stands for quick settings. It's called different things on different cameras, but you're basically just going to press this little Q button, and then it's hard to see. There's a lot of reflection here, but you can see some of the settings. If you look really close there, you'll see a page that looks like this. And so this is how you change most of the settings on the Canon cameras. It's very similar like on the Sony cameras. On the Sony cameras, it's called the function menu. You can see there. It's just a bunch of tiles like this. So we're just going to walk through all the different things on this menu. I might skip over some of them. If I'm skipping over it, it means it's not super important for video, but at the end we'll go back and I'll just speed run through some of the other stuff. So the first thing we're going to talk about is shutter speed. Shutter speed is really important for video. So when you take a photo, you have this thing that covers the sensor called the shutter, and it moves up and down. And so the shutter speed is just basically telling the camera how fast do I want to take the photo, or how fast do I want the shutter to move up and down. You might actually be able to see it here. Take this camera, we flip up the mirror. Sort of dark and hard to see, but in front of the sensor there's a shutter, and that will move up and down like this. And so for video, we want our shutter to be double our frame rate. I'll talk about frame rate a little bit later. So it would be 1 over double the frame rate. So if we're shooting in 24 frames per second, we would want 1 over 48 to be our shutter speed. But since this camera doesn't do 1 over 48, we have to get close. So 1 over 50. And generally we'll just leave it at 1 over 50. In photography you might play with the shutter speed, but in video you just want to leave it at 1 over 50 pretty much all the time. 1/50th of a second. You can set this in the Q menu using the back dial. So I can just turn this dial like this. And I actually have the camera set up so that even if I'm not in the Q menu, even if the screen is totally blank, I can just tilt this dial. You can set the camera up in different ways, though. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So the next tile we're going to talk about is aperture. Aperture is essentially how big the lens opening is. So if you've ever been to the eye doctor, they'll do the thing where they'll dilate your eyes. They'll make your pupils really small by shining a really bright light into your eye. And essentially that's what you do with lenses. So like I've got this old manual focus lens, and you can see you can look kind of straight through it. And if I take it and I close it down like this, that I'm changing the aperture. And so aperture is expressed in f-stop numbers. And so the smaller the number, the bigger the aperture opening. So this is at f3.5 right now, and if I close it all the way down, we're at f32. So it's sort of an inverse relationship. On the Canon cameras, you can set aperture using this top dial like this. Or once again, you can go into the Q menu and set it like that. There are some advantages to shooting at these really big apertures, these small numbers, and you can get what's like a sort of shallower depth of field, a sort of creamy background. You'll see this a lot in movies. If any of you have seen the show The Handmaid's Tale, they do this a lot, where they'll get really close up to a person and they'll blow the entire background out of focus, and it sort of gives that character like a sense of isolation, kind of being distinct from the background. Another thing that you can do with this is you can do out of focus motion, which is kind of a mysterious element. It kind of gives it a little mysterious quality. So like in photography, you want everything to be in focus all the time. But in video, sometimes having stuff out of focus is okay because it gives it sort of a mysterious look. And that out of focus background is called bokeh. It's a Japanese word. So next we're going to talk about ISO. ISO is basically just how sensitive the camera is to light. The higher the number, the more sensitive the camera is. This is a relic from the film days. So you used to have like speeds of film. So you would have like 100 speed film, and you couldn't change it. But now, since we're in the digital days, we can change our ISO pretty easily. So you see on the back of the camera here, we're in auto ISO. Sorry, it's like lots of reflection. Or in this example, we're at 100 ISO. 100 ISO would be good for like really bright sunny conditions, and then we would ratchet that up the darker it gets. There is a downside to ratcheting up the ISO though, in that it produces more sort of noise or grain in your image. So the higher the ISO, the more your image is going to degrade. Most cameras you want to keep in between about 100 and 3200. After that, it'll start to really fall apart. If you have a camera like the 5D with a big sensor, you could maybe push that to 12,800, but personally, I would never go above that. Other people have different ideas about what's acceptable in terms of an image, but I would never push my camera beyond 12,800. Cameras also have a native ISO, which is the ISO that they perform best at. And what I mean by perform is there's something called dynamic range, where the camera is able to, so dynamic range is how much information the camera is able to see in the darkest parts of the image and the brightest parts of the image. And so to get the most dynamic range, you want to use it at the native ISO. And normally that native ISO is the lowest ISO on the camera. So for the 5D, it's 100. To set ISO, what we've got to do, we can either set it in this Q menu here, once again with the back dial, or we can press on the top, the ISO button, and then use this top dial to set it back and forth. Sometimes you can use, this is the one sort of exception to the don't use auto rule. Auto ISO can be helpful in certain circumstances. So for example, if you're like walking in a forest and there are like really shady parts and really bright parts, we were just doing this in Belize, having auto ISO can be helpful to, so you're not having to constantly fuss with the camera. But if you're in like a pretty evenly lit daylight situation, you want to kind of leave it at 100. Or if you're, shooting at night, you want to kind of leave it at 1600, 3200, 6400, whatever. So as I mentioned earlier, we can remap what these buttons do. And on the Canon cameras, it's done with this tile right here. So if we go into that menu, we can see all of these buttons are remappable. So we can tell the camera, I want this dial on the back to change aperture instead of shutter speed. The way I like to do it is I like my back dial to control shutter speed and my top wheel to control aperture when I'm not in the Q menu. But it's personal preference. Other people like it different ways. You can also just remap some of these other buttons here, like this AF on. You can also just turn them off if you want. So let's talk picture profiles. That's this tile right here. Once again, we'll go back and talk about these later on. But picture profiles are really important. It's basically how the camera processes the color information that it sees. So by default, it's going to be in this S or standard mode. But for video, unlike in photos, we kind of want to make the image look as flat, as colorless, as non-contrasty as possible. AKA, we want to make the image really ugly. And so we want to make the image ugly because when we take the file from the camera and we put it into our post-processing program, our video editing program, we want the most latitude possible to change that on the computer. So the computer will always do a better job of processing the image than the camera will. And that goes back to that. We want full manual control. So we want to give the flattest image possible on this camera. So how do we do that? What we want to do is we want to go to into that picture profile menu. So if we click into that, you'll see all these different options. And we're going to go and select neutral. We're going to hover over neutral, and then we're going to click info, and we're going to set it so we're going to set the fine-tuned parameters on this. So these are not settings that I came up with. These are kind of the industry standards. So you want to set your sharpness to 0, your contrast to 0, your saturation to -2, and your color tone to 0. Actually, I'm sorry, I have it wrong here. I think in my PowerPoint, the contrast you want to be -4, so no contrast whatsoever, because you can always go and add that back in post. So if you see it's here, it's 0, -4, -2, 0. And then when we're done, you can just click the menu button to go back. And to set these, you just hover over them and click the set button. Some cameras actually have the option of a even flatter profile called log. If you'll see this a lot in newer cameras, so my cameras don't have the option of log, but if you have like a Sony a7 III or any of the newer Sony cameras or the newer Canon cameras, a lot of them have the option of a log picture profile. And if you have the option of using that, that's what I would recommend. Let's talk white balance. So white balance is like how the camera sees color. So your eyes are really good at white balancing. When you walk outside, colors look the same as like when you walk inside, but the camera can't really do the same thing as well. So inside things might be really blue, and outside things might be more orangey based on how sunny it is and those kinds of things. And so you have to set the camera to see the color in a proper way. And those color temperatures are expressed in Kelvin. So you might have heard of Kelvin like in your science class as a measure of temperature. It can also be a measure of color. So ideally you would set this, if you're in an interview situation, for example, you have a white piece of paper, a white card that you would hold up, and you would set the camera that way to the white card. And then that would balance you'd have a custom white balance for that scene. But when you're sort of running and gunning, the auto white balance generally works okay. This is another exception to the manual only rule. And white balance is also pretty easy to change in post, so if you screw it up royally, you can probably fix it. Focus. So you can see here, we're in an autofocus mode on the camera, and let's see here. We're in an autofocus mode on the camera, and in general, with these old cameras, we don't want to rely on autofocus. So autofocus is basically letting the camera do the work of focusing for us. Manual focus is when we focus the camera ourselves. With these old cameras, most of them do a really bad job at focusing. They do, they'll focus on the wrong thing, they'll move back and forth and hunt, and we don't want that. So we want to set it to manual focus. You can do that in camera, or you can change it on the lens, which is my preferred method. So you've just got this little switch here. You can switch it to AF, stand for autofocus, or manual focus. So I just prefer to switch it on the lens, and then you can focus on the lens using this ring here. Sometimes the rings are reversed depending on your lens, so sometimes the focus ring is here and the zoom ring is here. But on these Canon cameras, the focus ring is out here. And then it's nice because I can just use my thumb like this and focus this way. These Canon cameras are also nice because they have this, focus guide. So you can see in the image here, the thing that's in focus is about 1.2 meters away, or about 4 feet away. So that's a really nice feature of this. And some of the newer cameras do have good autofocus, but these old cameras that we're working with generally don't. So I don't trust it. So let's get started with like shooting some actual video. So how do you do that? So you can see right now on our switch we're in photo mode. The little tick is on the little white camera. And so switch into video mode, we just click it over and we'll see that we can see my face because we switched over to video mode. And so you want to switch that switch. And when you do, you'll see a whole new page, which will look like that. You'll see the live view, and then you'll see some of those same settings that we were talking about earlier down here at the bottom. So you'll see shutter speed, aperture. This is what's called your light meter or your exposure meter. Basically, if you're in these plus numbers, it means your image is too bright, and if you're in these minus numbers, your image is too dark. So you want to keep it generally around this 0 mark. For these cameras, it's better to be in the minus numbers than the plus numbers, though. So you never really want to be in these plus numbers because it means you can't really go and recover the image in post-production. You see our ISO here, we're set on auto. Our battery life, this means we need to charge our battery. And then this is the amount of photos you can take, which I don't know why they put that in there since this is the video mode. But I guess it's sort of a general guide of how much space your memory card has. So to change our settings for video, we're going to dive into a different menu, and that's the one you get when you press the menu button. So we're just going to press our menu button like this, and you'll see these menus. And we're going to, most of the other stuff is not really important for video. But we want to go to this fourth page on this first pane. So each of these panes has a couple of pages. So we want to go to the fourth page. And then I would recommend turning on this grid display. This will be really helpful for you when you start to shoot video for composition. But then we're going to go to this movie record size. And we'll click set. And that'll lead us to this page with all these confusing numbers and letters. So as I was mentioning earlier about frame rate is basically just how many photos the camera is taking to stitch into video. So most of your Hollywood movies, your documentaries are shot in 24 frames per second, which means each second has 24 different images. And then this 1920 by 1080 is how big those photos are. So 1,920 pixels wide by 1,080 pixels tall. And so we want to keep our camera in 24 frames per second so we can get that sort of same cinematic look. And this low comp interframe all I, basically what that means is low compression. So we want the highest quality 1080p image that we can get. So we're going to leave this. I would just leave this there always for the 5D Mark III. Some of the other cameras, like this Sony camera here, has the option of shooting 1080p in 60 frames per second. And that's good if you want to slow it down. So you can, I think, like slow it down like 2.4 times. So you just basically stretch out the clip and you can get like slow-mo video in 24 frames per second. So that's good for B-roll and those kinds of things. So let's talk a little bit about lenses here. There are two types of lens. There are zoom lenses and prime lenses. So zoom lenses, obviously, you can zoom in and out like this. This is a prime lens, so it doesn't zoom or do anything. It just stays like that. Both have their benefits. Prime lenses tend to be sharper, and they tend to have bigger apertures, so smaller numbers. Zoom lenses are more versatile sometimes if you're running around. And then there are three categories of lens. There are wide lenses, standard lenses, telephoto lenses. So wide is anywhere between about 12 millimeters and about 35 millimeters. Your standard is between like 35 and 55 millimeters. And 55 and beyond is a telephoto range. So the nice thing about this lens here is it starts at 24 and it goes to 70. So you start with wide, and then you get into standard, and you get into telephoto. So it's a really versatile lens, this 24 to 70. And also, This lens here is a 135, so it's a shorter telephoto lens. This is a wide-angle zoom lens, so this goes from 16 to 35. All of these, have their uses. The nice thing about wide lenses is that they are more stable. So when you're zoomed into 200 millimeters, the shake of your hands gets magnified, just like your image gets magnified. And so having wide lenses generally results in less shaky video. The downside of wide lenses, though, is that they tend to distort. So they make people's faces look like really wide and like weird, and they'll kind of curve on the corners and stuff. But each of these has their purpose. Some lenses actually can correct for your shaky hands. They have stabilization built in, where the elements of the lens will actually like move around in different ways to counteract the shake of your hands. And some cameras are also getting this as well, where the image sensor will move around to counteract that shake. For video, you want to look for lenses that have really good manual focus rings, like we were talking about earlier. So like this lens has that focus guide, and I can just move the lens with my thumb, and I can see, how far away I'm focusing. With some of the newer lenses, the focus ring is electronic, and I can't really see what's going on. So you want to look for a lens that has good manual focus rings. So let's do some tips for shooting. When you're shooting, you always want to have 3 points of contact on the camera. So if I'm shooting with this 5D, for example, my 3 points of contact would be 1, this hand on the grip, 1 hand on the lens, like this, and then the neck strap. And we want to have our neck strap nice and tight, so our movements are very smooth, like this. You can see my neck strap is totally pulled out and tight. A lot of us at UNC will also shoot on a monopod, which is basically just a stick with 3 little feet. You'll put your camera on top of that, and it will steady the camera like that. And so when you're shooting, you also want to think about shot variety. So you want to think about getting wide shots, so that's like the shot of the crowd or the shot of like a big landscape like the mountains. So you get a couple of those, you get a couple medium shots. So these are good for like people talking, for example. That's like a waist up or a full body shot. And then close-ups, so things like people's eyes, you can get really close in on, or people's hands. Hands can often be really emotive. Or if somebody's doing something really detailed with their fingers, those are really good close-up shots. So when you're shooting a scene, you want to get all 3 types of shots so that you can build the scene properly when you go into your editing program. As I was mentioning earlier, if you have the option, shoot in different frame rates. So you want to keep 24 for talking heads anytime a person is talking, because you would never want to slow down somebody talking because it sounds like they're underwater. It's like the wall, So if you have a camera like this that will shoot 60 frames in 1080p, you might try messing with that. Unfortunately, this 5D camera doesn't really do that in 1080p, so I just kind of leave it at 24. And 24 is generally just the safest option to shoot things at. You can see the grid here, like we were talking about earlier in the menu. It divides the image up into 3 vertical sections and 3 horizontal sections, and these are equal. And so when you're composing your shot, you want to put your subjects at the intersections of these grids. So if you've somebody's head, for example, you might want to put in this rightmost intersection. Or, if they're facing the left, you want to give them some space. If they're facing right, you might want to put them on this left intersection here. And then also look for natural frames and leading lines. So you can see that this is a frame right here. There's like an archway, and you want to put somebody in that frame. And then there's also lines leading us straight down to this box. So there's a line leading us straight down to this box. Those are just sort of general tips for composition. Other stuff, as promised, I would talk about, all the other little things on the camera. So this is a viewfinder, as I was talking about earlier. It takes the light and then bounces it up. But since we're shooting video, the mirror will be flipped up always, so this is pretty much useless for shooting video. These 4 buttons on the side, this top one is like a creative button. I never use it, so we're just gonna move past it. This is the rate button. So if you click the little playback button here, you can see all the photos and videos that you've taken. And if you want to say, hey, that's a really good photo, you can click the rate button between 1 and 5 times, so 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, 4 star, 5 star, and rate it. And then when you bring it into your editing software, you can say, this is a 5-star image. You can just see off the top of your head, so it can save some time in that way. This magnifying glass button is like the info button for video, but if you're looking at stills, it will zoom in, so you can just see more fine details. And then the trash can is for deleting stuff. So say you take a particularly awful photo or video, you can just go and delete it. Happens to the best of us. These other things on this row, this is exposure compensation. I would just leave this alone. Basically what this is for is, say you set these settings and you want it to be 1 stop brighter than the settings that you set. That's what you would use exposure compensation for. But I find that that's annoying because you never remember, when you have it on and then your photos are too bright or too dark, and I just leave it alone. This next tile here is for flash. We don't really use flash for video, so I just leave that alone. I'm going to be honest, I had to look up what these 2 tiles meant because I never used them. This is white balance compensation and auto lighting optimization. I just leave those alone. These big tiles on the side here, this one's for memory cards. So the nice thing about this 5D camera is that it takes 2 different memory cards. You can kind of see here, there's a big slot, and then there's this small slot here where you can put an SD card. So if I put this is really nice when you're shooting photos because you can record photos to both memory cards. But unfortunately for video, it doesn't do that. So it's not really super important what kind of memory card you have in there, just as long as it's like a quality SD. And then this box next to it that says RAW, that has to do with image quality. Since we're taking video, it doesn't really matter. In this final row, this is metering. Metering is actually kind of important. Basically, it's where the camera measures its exposure values from. So you can either set that to the center of the frame, or you can say evaluate the whole frame for exposure. Different situations will call for different things. Like interview, you might want to do center because the person in the interview is in the center of the frame. Or if you're shooting outside, you might want to do evaluative. The thing next to it is drive mode. This is only for photography. This is basically how many photos, when we're shooting photos, you want to take in a second. And the little S is for silent, so it'll dampen the shutter a little bit. It'll be a little quieter. These buttons on the top have to do with autofocus, which once again we're not using. So I just generally leave those alone. You can even turn those off with the custom buttons. So that's really all I had. Any questions, you can leave them in the chat, and Emily can ask them for you, or I can just look in the chat as well. Let's see the chat. Anyone? So someone's asking about the difference between AI servo and AI single. AI servo basically just means the camera will continuously autofocus. Sorry about the bell here. But the camera will continuously autofocus for moving subjects. AI single is if you just have a still subject and you want to just focus on that subject, I generally leave it in servo all the time, even if I'm shooting single subjects, because people in particular will tend to move just like a little bit, and your things will be out of focus. So I just leave it in servo all the time when I'm shooting photos. For video, once again, I'm just using manual focus pretty much all the time.
It looks like we got another question.
So somebody's asking about good, cheap cameras for beginners. It really depends on the system that you want to invest in. So there are kind of a couple major systems. There's the Canon system, which is what we use in the journalism school, the Sony system, and the Nikon system. I would recommend either going with the Canon or the Sony system at this point. They're kind of the most mature for video. Good, I think the A6100, this is an A6000, it's a little older. The A6100 for Sony is a nice little camera. If you can swing a little bit more, the Canon EOS RP has a full frame sensor. That's a nice little camera. I think the 6100 is about 500 or 600 bucks, and the RP is like 800 bucks. And then you can always find stuff used as well. You can also get one of these, the 5D Mark III, used for like less than $1,000 now. And this is a really fantastic camera for stills and video. I mean, it's a little less good for video, but it's just, I mean, you can beat them up. We carry them everywhere. We've shot all sorts of stuff with it. So you can get a used 5D, and that'll be a good start as well. So those are my recommendations. Somebody's asking about shooting log, meaning you'll have bigger files. No, because log is like a picture profile. Some cameras actually do raw video, so that will generate huge file sizes. But log, since log is like a picture profile, it's just how the camera processes the color, so it generally doesn't create bigger files. People are asking about resources for learning more, practicing. I learned a ton by just watching YouTube videos, to be honest. So, watching a ton of the popular camera YouTubers. Jared Poland makes camera videos. There's this guy, Kai W, who makes great camera videos. There's a bunch of these people around, and they have some great beginner videos and camera reviews and things. The other thing that's been really helpful is just hanging out with the, other people who are shooting video and shooting photos. You might learn stuff like settings from YouTube videos, but there are just those little things that you'll learn from just hanging out with like-minded people that are really valuable and important. So I try to generally, when I'm working on a video project, I try to get in a collaborative space so people can look at my work and evaluate, and they might have, some little tidbit of knowledge. So those are my two recommendations. Find like-minded people, maybe somebody who's a little bit more advanced in their career, who's been shooting for a long time, and you can hang out with them and they can give you some tips, or you can go out and shoot together. That's always fun. So person saying, when they're shooting, they often come out overexposed, asking about which settings you would adjust first. So ISO, shutter speed, and aperture make up what we call the exposure triangle. So each is the point in the triangle. And so for photo, it does, it matters less, I would say, which one you adjust first. For video, you never want to adjust your shutter speed. That's the last thing that you touch. And your ISO, so one of the problems you have with video a lot is if you're in a really bright situation, you have, even setting it up to 100 and 1/50th of a second, like you just can't make the camera dark enough. And so people will buy filters to put on the front of their lens to darken the image. But for video, I would say touch the aperture first. So touch the ISO first if it's in a bright situation, and then I would do aperture. and then last resort touch the shutter speed, but you generally want to leave the shutter speed alone. And if you're in a really bright condition and you're at ISO 100 and you're constantly having to move your aperture down to like f22, maybe think about getting, they're called variable ND filters. You can just screw them onto the front of your lens. Those have been really helpful for some of my colleagues. And then, you know, making the call on the fly is just, particularly with photos, just practice. You know, as I was talking about earlier with aperture, aperture has its own sort of unique qualities. So like when you have a low number aperture, things will be out of focus, and that can be kind of a unique benefit. It can give it a really cool look. But sometimes if you're taking like a crowd shot, you want to get the whole scene. So it's just a lot of practice. It's just going out and shooting and learning how to you know, work with the camera that you have, and that's just what I would recommend. A lot of practice, practice, practice. Someone's asking about shooting in manual focus. Leaves a lot of room for error. That's true. Tips for keeping your image in focus when you're shooting in manual. That's definitely true. That's what's so nice about the new cameras having autofocus, is that you don't have to rely on the manual focus. But one tip that we use is if you have a zoom lens, zoom all the way in and zoom and adjust the focus so it's just on like their nose, for example, or their eye, and you can and then you can also press this zoom button and zoom in even more before you start recording on the camera, so you can see like, is this in focus? So that's a good tip. Obviously that's practical for like interview settings where people are sitting down and you have time to you know, adjust and stuff. For running gun situations, it's a little harder. You might try just shooting at a less shallow aperture, so going from f2.8 to f4, just so you can get things a little bit sharper, and just monitoring the screen a lot. The sharper your screen is, the better you'll be able to adjust for this. And then manual focus, just like everything, is practice. You know, you have to figure out which way your ring turns. Some rings turn the opposite way, and it's horrible. So you just have to figure out which way your ring turns, and then just be looking at the screen. But those are my recommendations for shooting manual focus. Somebody's asking about gimbals. Gimbals, for those who don't know, it's a type of stabilization for cameras. So what it does is it's like a little stick, and then it's got this whole apparatus, and it will move the camera, you know, side to side, up and down, right, left, to compensate for your shake. I think gimbals are great. We used one in Belize, a few weeks ago, and had some really great results. I don't think it's like a necessary tool to start out with, but if you can afford it, they're really nice. The downside of gimbals is that you have to balance them, and if they're not balanced perfectly, then you can end up with some really wonky stuff. But the newer DJI gimbals are really forgiving in terms of balance. So like we stuck, you know, one of these 5D cameras on top of the gimbal, and it was very forgiving of, you know, us taking the camera off and putting it back on. So if you can swing it, gimbals are really nice. Anyone else have questions? Just looking through. If you think of something later, you can contact me. You can DM me on Twitter or Instagram, and also just see my dumb tweets and some of my photos there as well. You can send me an email, ari_sen@berkeley.edu. And if you wanted to watch the rest of some of those documentaries, you can go to my website, which is just arisenjournalism.com. Yeah, so unless there's anything else. So we are going to have more sessions coming up later this week and also next week. So on Thursday, Zayrha is going to be leading a session about how to set up an interview. That'll be really good. That's going to be at 3 p.m. on Thursday. And then at, I think, 10 a.m. on Monday, Hadley's going to be teaching a session on audio, which is something I didn't really touch on in this session, but that's probably the most important part when you're shooting video. So that'll be a really important session for those of you starting out. And Hadley's amazing. Zayrha is also amazing, but Hadley's working at the Washington Post right now. Fantastic videographer, much better than myself. So that would be one not to miss. So if anyone else, if there are no further questions, you can, I think we'll be done. I'll hang around here for 5 more minutes or so if there are any other questions. Since this session was supposed to go till 4, but if not, you can head out. Let's be looking at the chat here. Someone's asking about speed lights and strobes. I'm not an expert in flashes, particularly, flashes are generally only used for photo. Maybe Emily might know the difference between a speed light and a strobe, but I'm not super familiar with flashes. I don't really ever use flash in my photography. I'm more photojournalistic. Flashes are generally used for studio work. Emily, I don't know if you can talk, or if you're still on the call, but maybe you can answer that question.
Yeah, so in the photojournalism program at UNC, we mainly learn how to use speed lights. So like the main difference.
Looks like she's still on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. The main difference between speed lights and strobes is that strobes are more for studio work and more for like, you would see it more for like modeling photo shoots. And speed lights are much more portable, more versatile. So at least in like photojournalism where you're on the move a lot, I see more people using speed lights than strobes. But if you're doing something where it's more like studio work, if it's like a fine art photo, or if you're doing like fashion photography, they use more strobes because it's a controlled environment, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Emily. I was interested to learn that as well, so that's good. But once again, for video, if we are using lights, it's usually constant light. So it's like you'll get those little light panels. In Belize, we had these long sticks of light that we used, and those were really helpful. That's how we lit our interviews. But yeah, video, it's all constant light, like a panel, or LED panel or something. And if you're for interviews, sometimes you'll get these big softbox lights, and those are all constant. Any other questions? Last minute questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace, or you can email me as well. Oh, I forgot. Let me share the link to this PowerPoint so that y'all can access it. I'm sure Emily will also put this up on you'll have access to the video, but let me share this PowerPoint as well so that people can see it. Oh, geez. I'm just going to put that in the chat here. So if you want to go back and look at this PowerPoint um, for future reference, you can go do that. All right. If there aren't any other questions, I think we're going to end it here. Thanks for coming to our first session. This was a new experience for me, teaching these sessions. So I hope you'll come to the future ones with Zayrha and Hadley and all of these wonderful people coming up. So thanks again.